6:10 a.m., October 14, 1947, Muroc Army Airfield, California. Chuck Yeager is lying on his back inside a rocket-powered aircraft the size of a large bomb, suspended 20,000 feet in the air under the belly of a B-29 bomber. He has 2 fractured ribs. The hatch next to him, which is the only barrier between his body and a 20,000-foot drop into the Mojave Desert, will not seal. The lever required to lock it demands a hard downward pull with the right arm, and his right arm is currently taped to his chest by a civilian doctor he visited in secret 3 days earlier, because if the Air Force found out he was injured, they would pull him from the mission entirely. What happens next changed the physics of aerial warfare forever. Charles Elwood Yeager was born February 13, 1923, in Myra, West Virginia, and raised in Hamlin, a town most people have never heard of and couldn't find on a map. His father farmed, while his mother kept the house. He had a childhood spent outdoors in the kind of rural environment where you either learn to fix things yourself or you go without. He graduated in June 1941 with no college plans and a country that was 12 weeks away from entering the Second World War. On September 12, 1941, he walked into a recruitment office and enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Forces as a private. He was 18 years old. He wanted to fly. They told him no, too young, not enough education, and handed him a wrench instead. The Army Air Forces had a problem in 1941 that nobody talked about out loud, which was that aircraft were getting faster, faster than anyone fully understood. By the time Yeager enlisted, high-performance fighters were routinely hitting speeds in terminal dives that caused something engineers called compressibility, a phenomenon where shock waves built across the airframe as a plane approached the speed of sound and sent aircraft into dives no pilot could recover from. Between 1941 and 1947, an estimated 150 Allied and Axis pilots died in incidents directly attributable to transonic compressibility. Most of them never knew what killed them. The aircraft simply stopped responding and came apart. The assumption built into almost every aviation program on Earth was that the sound barrier was a hard ceiling, that the physics of supersonic flight were either lethally unstable or outright impossible for a manned aircraft. Bell Aircraft had built the XS-1 specifically to test that assumption, and they had already asked their own test pilot to attempt the flight. Meanwhile, at George Air Force Base in Victorville, California, an 18-year-old mechanic from West Virginia was learning things about aircraft that most pilots would never bother to understand. Yeager spent his first year in the Air Forces not in a cockpit, but under one. He worked the flight line at George Air Force Base as an aircraft mechanic, and after the war, his combination of flight hours, mechanical experience, and maintenance background made him a natural candidate for test work. He was assigned to Muroc Army Airfield and eventually selected for the XS-1 program. Bell Aircraft's test pilot had wanted $150,000. Yeager was a captain on a captain's salary who said yes because that was the job. 2 nights before the scheduled flight, Yeager went horseback riding with his wife Glennis. The horse threw him and he hit the ground and fractured 2 ribs on his right side. He drove to a civilian doctor in the nearby town of Rosamond, had his ribs taped, and told no one in the Air Force. Reporting the injury meant being grounded, and being grounded meant someone else flew the mission. That was not acceptable to him. The problem he hadn't fully calculated was the hatch. The XS-1's entry hatch locked from the inside using a lever mechanism that required the pilot to brace and drive it downward with huge force using the right arm. With fractured ribs and a taped chest, Yeager couldn't generate that movement without risking enough additional injury to incapacitate him at altitude. He worked through the problem the same way he'd been working through mechanical problems since he was 18 years old on a flight line in Victorville. He looked at what was available. He went to his friend and fellow project pilot Jack Ridley and explained the situation. Ridley went to a utility closet, found a broom, and sawed off a section of the handle approximately 6 inches long. The extension reduced the lever arm enough that Yeager could seal the hatch using his left side, transferring the mechanical load away from his injured ribs entirely. The sawed-off broom handle was not an approved aerospace component. At 6:10 a.m. on October 14, 1947, Yeager climbed into the XS-1, which he had named Glamorous Glennis after his wife, while it hung beneath the B-29 at 7,000 feet. Using the broom handle extension, he sealed the hatch with his left arm. At 20,000 feet, the B-29 released him into open air. He ignited the rocket chambers in sequence and climbed hard toward 45,000 feet, the aircraft accelerating beyond anything a propeller-driven plane could approach. The Mach-meter climbed through 0.85, the point where compressibility had been killing pilots for 6 years. It passed 0.9. At 0.96, the needle began oscillating, the familiar threshold instability that had preceded so many fatal incidents. Then the oscillation stopped and the needle swung past 1.0 and held steady at 1.05. For the first time in recorded history, a human being was traveling faster than the speed of sound in level flight. The ride, Yeager later said, was smoother than anything he had experienced below Mach 1. He flew supersonic for approximately 20 seconds, then descended, landed on the dry lake bed, climbed out, and handed Ridley back the broom handle. Strangely enough, the public would not learn about it for 8 months. The data collected from Yeager's XS-1 flights formed the aerodynamic foundation for the American space program. The NACA program he flew under became NASA. In 1962, Yeager became the first commandant of the USAF Aerospace Research Pilot School, the institution that trained the astronauts who flew Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. The men who went to the moon trained under a program built by a pilot who had been turned away from flight school for being too young and too undereducated, and who had spent his first year in the Air Forces learning to fix aircraft with whatever was at hand. Yeager was promoted to Brigadier General in 1969 and inducted into the National Aviation Hall of Fame in 1973. He retired from active duty on March 1, 1975, a date he selected deliberately for its phonetic resemblance to Mach 1. On October 14, 1997, 50 years after the original flight, he broke the sound barrier again in an F-15D Eagle at age 74. On October 14, 2012, he did it a third time at 89. Chuck Yeager died on December 7, 2020, at 97 years old.